Experience the kinetic energy of a soul in motion, constantly evolving and pushing against the boundaries of reality. Our 3D cinematic visuals capture the heat and the passion of a life lived at full speed. Subscribe today and feel the incredible power of a story that never stops.
The morning my son called to tell me he was engaged, I was standing in my garage, refinishing an old oak dresser I'd pulled from an estate sale. My hands were covered in stain. The radio was playing something low and forgettable, and when I heard the excitement in his voice, I set down my brush and smiled. He'd found someone. After everything he'd been through, my son had found someone. I should have paid more attention to the feeling that came right after the smile, the one that sat just beneath it, quiet and uninvited, like a stone dropping into still water. Her name was Renee. My son, I'll call him my son, because that's all that matters here, brought her to Sunday dinner about 3 weeks after the call. She arrived carrying a bottle of wine she'd clearly Googled beforehand, something with a French label that was just expensive enough to impress without being obvious about it. She shook my hand with both of hers, looked me directly in the eyes, and said she'd heard so much about me. I am 63 years old. I have run a small but successful commercial real estate business for 31 years. I have negotiated with people who lied to my face across conference tables, people who smiled while they were taking from me, people who had practiced their warmth the way actors practice lines. I know what genuine looks like. I know what performed looks like. Renee was very, very good, but she was performed. I told myself I was being unfair. My son was 34, and this was the first woman he'd brought home since his divorce 2 years ago. I was projecting. I was being the difficult father. I poured the wine and asked her about her work, and she talked about her marketing consultancy with just the right amount of confidence, not bragging, just clear. And I listened and nodded and refilled everyone's glass. After dinner, while she was in the restroom, my son looked at me the way he's looked at me since he was 7 years old, waiting for my verdict on something. I said she seemed lovely. His whole body relaxed. I hated myself a little for the stones still sitting at the bottom of my chest. They got engaged 4 months later. The wedding planning started almost immediately, which I thought was fast. But Renee explained she'd always wanted a spring wedding, and spring was only 8 months away. She had a vision. She walked me through it one evening over coffee, a venue outside Asheville she'd fallen in love with, a guest list of about 200, a photographer whose work she showed me on her phone, a caterer, a florist, a string quartet for the ceremony. She said it with the ease of someone describing a vacation they'd already booked. My son makes a good living. He's an engineer, careful with money, has been since he was a teenager, counting his lawn mowing income in a notebook. But the number Renee described when I finally got it out of her in a direct conversation about finances was not a number a careful engineer with 2 years of rebuilding after a divorce could absorb without bleeding. I asked my son about it privately. He told me they were splitting it. He said it with the particular flatness of someone who has already had the argument and lost it. I wrote a check to cover his half. I told him it was a wedding gift. He thanked me with his eyes wet, and I pretended not to notice. What I did not tell him was that I had started paying attention. It started with small things. The way Renee deferred questions about her own family parents in poor health, a brother she'd lost touch with, a childhood she described in the vaguest possible terms. When I asked follow-up questions, she redirected with the smoothness of a talk show host. I am not a suspicious man by nature, but I am an observant one, and I have spent 3 decades reading people across negotiating tables. I noticed that she never paid for anything when we were all together, always reaching for her purse just a half-second too late. I noticed that her consultancy, when I tried to look it up, had a website that was 3 pages deep and a LinkedIn profile with 31 connections. I noticed that she knew exactly what I was worth, not the rough figure people might guess, but the real number, the private number, and I had never told her. My son hadn't told her either. I asked him, carefully. One afternoon when we were watching a game together, he gave me a strange look and said no. Why would he? He didn't even know the full picture of my holdings. I had kept certain things private for reasons I won't go into here. the way men of a certain generation sometimes do, not from secrecy but from hard-learned caution. So how did she know? I let that question sit for a while. I am patient. It is possibly my most useful quality. The engagement party was at my house. Renee's side of the guest list was 11 people. Friends she described as scattered and busy. No family, and my son's side was the usual crowd. People who had watched him grow up. Colleagues, neighbors who had known his mother. It was a warm evening in October. The yard lit up, food everywhere. And at some point I found myself standing near the back fence watching Renee work the room. That is the only way I can describe it. She worked it. She remembered every name, deployed every story at exactly the right moment. Laughed at exactly the right volume. She was extraordinary to watch. She was also, at one point, alone in my study for about 12 minutes while everyone else was outside. I know this because I have a small camera in my study, not for surveillance, but because I had a break-in 3 years ago and the room holds documents I can't replace. I didn't check the footage until later. When I did, I watched Renee standing at my desk, not touching anything, just reading. Reading the framed letter on the wall behind my chair, a personal letter, the kind that wouldn't tell a stranger much, and then, slowly and deliberately, opening the top right drawer. She didn't take anything. She looked at the folder inside, the one with the name of my primary holding company on the tab, closed the drawer, and walked back to the party. I sat with that footage for a long time. I want to be precise about what I felt, because I think it matters. I was not angry yet. Anger came later. What I felt in that moment was something closer to grief. The specific grief of watching a suspicion you had hoped was wrong become a fact you can no longer avoid. I thought about my son's face when I told him she seemed lovely. I thought about his body relaxing. I called a man I have worked with for 15 years, a man whose professional discretion I would trust with my life. I told him I needed a background check, and I needed it done quietly. I gave him Renee's full name, her date of birth, the city she'd told my son she was from. I told him to take whatever time he needed, but to be thorough. He came back to me in 11 days. I am not going to detail everything he found, because some of it is not my story to tell, and because the parts that matter are enough. What I will say is this. Renee had been engaged before. Twice. Once in her late 20s to a man in Atlanta who was a partner at an architecture firm, and once 4 years ago to a man in Charlotte who ran a distribution company. Both engagements had ended. In both cases, the men had been comfortable financially. In both cases, the termination of the engagement had involved legal proceedings around deposits, payments made, and in one case a joint account that had been cleaned out 9 days before she called things off. She had not been married. She had not been convicted of anything. She was, in the technical sense, a free woman who had made choices that hurt people without ever quite crossing the lines that laws are written to address. My son did not know any of this. I spent 3 days deciding what to do with the information. I am going to be honest about those 3 days, because I think they reflect something true about being a father. I thought about going directly to my son. I thought about sitting him down and putting the report on the table and letting him read it. I ran that conversation in my head more times than I can count. Every version of it ended with his face, and I could not get past his face. Because here is the thing about my son. He is not naive. He is intelligent and perceptive, and he had his heart broken thoroughly by his first marriage, a slow and painful unwinding that I watched over 3 years with my hands tied. He had been careful this time. He had been deliberate. He had done everything you are supposed to do. And he had still ended up here. I knew that if I went to him with a piece of paper, the first thing he would feel before the betrayal, before the anger, before anything useful was humiliation. And that humiliation might make him defensive of her before it made him careful. I needed him to see it, not be told it. The rehearsal dinner was at a restaurant downtown that Renee had selected. 60 people, a private room, the kind of event designed to feel intimate while actually being a performance. I arrived early. I sat at the bar and had a club soda, and I watched the room fill up. Renee came in on my son's arm, wearing something that I'm sure had cost more than it looked, And she was radiant in the way she was always radiant, switched on, scanning, present in the way that is really a form of calculation. She embraced people. She laughed. She made my son's aunt feel like the most important person in the room for exactly 4 minutes, and then moved on. My son found me at the bar, and we stood together for a moment. He looked happy. He looked the way I had wanted him to look for 2 years. I put my hand on his shoulder, and I felt the weight of what I was carrying. About 40 minutes into the evening, he appeared at my elbow and said he needed some air. We stepped into the hallway near the coat check. Just the two of us, and he was quiet for a moment, in a way that I recognized that particular quiet that means he's been sitting with something and doesn't know how to start. Then he said, "Dad, I found something last week." I waited. I was on her laptop. She asked me to print something. I wasn't snooping, and I saw an email thread from a law firm in Charlotte about a dispute over funds from a broken engagement. He stopped. His jaw was tight. I looked up the name. The guy. I found him on LinkedIn. He hadn't told me. He had been carrying it for a week, alone, while finalizing seating charts and picking up his suit. "I don't know what to do," he said. "I love her. I think I love her. But I feel like I've been." He stopped again. "I keep looking at her and trying to decide if what I'm seeing is real." I put my hand on his arm and I told him to look at me. He did. I told him I had some things to share with him. I told him I had not come to this evening empty-handed. I told him that whatever he decided to do, he would not be making that decision with incomplete information, and he would not be making it alone. We stood in that hallway for 22 minutes. I told him everything. I showed him the summary my contact had prepared. I had printed it, folded it into my jacket pocket 3 days before, not knowing exactly when I would need it. He read it standing under the coat check light, his face going through things I am not going to describe because they belong to him. When he finished, he folded the paper and held it for a moment. Then he asked me one question. He said, "Was any of it real, do you think?" I said I didn't know. I said I thought that might be a question without an answer, and that it might have to be okay that there wasn't one. He nodded. He put the paper in his own jacket pocket. He straightened up. He walked back into that room, and he was composed in a way that made me proud, in a manner I cannot fully articulate the way you are proud of someone. Not for what they've achieved, but for who they turn out to be when things are hard. He did not make a scene. He did not confront her in front of 60 people. He got through that dinner with grace, and when it was over, he asked Renee to stay after, and they had a conversation in private that I was not part of, and that he has only described to me in pieces. She denied it at first. Then she stopped denying it and went quiet in the way that is itself a form of confession. She did not cry. He told me later that was the detail he kept coming back to. She did not cry. The wedding did not happen. There were calls to vendors, deposits that were partially recovered and partially lost, real money. Money I had written checks for. Money my son had saved. There was a period of paperwork, and there were some conversations with lawyers about the joint account they had opened for wedding expenses, which had seen some activity that required attention. That part resolved. Eventually, in the way that such things resolve when one party has documentation, and the other party ultimately decides that fighting is not in their interest. My son took 3 weeks off work. He drove out to see a college friend in Colorado, someone he'd drifted from over the years of the relationship. He called me from the mountains one evening, his voice different than it had been, quieter, but not broken. He said the aspens were turning, and that he'd forgotten how much he liked being somewhere with altitude. I told him I was glad he went. He came back, and after a few weeks he started to seem like himself again, not the himself from during the engagement. The one that I now recognized had been quieter and smaller somehow, but the earlier himself, the one who fills up a room without trying, who laughs easily, who argues with me about baseball statistics with genuine heat. We don't talk about Renee much. When we do, he is matter-of-fact about it, in the way that tells me he's done real work to get there. He told me once that he wasn't angry at himself for loving her, because he said he didn't think you can love the performance of a person and be blamed for it. You loved what was put in front of you. What was put in front of you just wasn't true. I thought that was a remarkably clear-eyed thing to say. There is something I think about when I let myself sit with this whole story. And it's not about Renee, or about the money, or about the legal back and forth that I'm glad is behind us. What I think about is the hallway outside the coat check. My son standing there telling me he'd been carrying something alone for a week. 34 years ago, I held him in a hospital room and made him the usual silent promises. I was 29 and terrified and entirely unprepared, the way everyone is. And the promises were the usual ones: safety, presence, honesty, the ordinary architecture of what a father is supposed to be. I do not think I always got it right. There were years when work took up space it shouldn't have. Years when I was present in the house but not really present. Years when I thought providing for him was the same as being available to him, which it isn't. His mother knew that. She told me, gently, and then less gently, over the years. But in that hallway, he came to me. After a week of carrying it alone, he came to me, and I happened to have the thing he needed. Because I had been paying attention, because something in me had refused to look away, even when looking away would have been easier and more comfortable, and would have let me be the father who stays in his lane and trusts his adult child to handle things. I don't know that I made the right call on every decision in those months. I second-guessed the background check more than once. It felt like a line, and I am still not entirely sure I was right to cross it. What I can say is that I crossed it out of love and not out of control, and that when the information came back, I waited, and I was patient, and I tried to give my son the thing he needed, rather than the thing that would have been easier for me. He bought a small house last spring. Sends me photos sometimes, a new bookcase. The yard before and after he raked it. A project he's doing with the kitchen cabinets that he insists he can handle himself. I tell him to call a professional. He ignores me. It is an old conversation and I mean it less every time. He came by for dinner 2 Sundays ago. I made pot roast, his mother's recipe, the one that takes most of the day. We ate at the kitchen table and watched the end of the game, and I listened to him talk about a friend at work who just had a baby and a trail he wants to hike before the weather turns, and whether he should get a dog. I said I thought he should get a dog. He said he'd think about it. We sat there a while after the plates were cleared, not talking about anything particular. The kitchen smelled like the roast, and outside it was starting to get dark the way it does in fall, early and soft. He had his coffee and I had mine, and we were just 2 people in a kitchen, which is maybe the most ordinary thing in the world, and I held on to it the way you hold on to ordinary things when you are 63 and you understand, in a way you did not when you were 29, how much weight they carry.